All right, welcome to Environmental Science here at NICC. This brief presentation is going to be here to provide you with a little bit of background for the Sumino oyster case study that you'll be working on. This PowerPoint is provided as part of the teaching tools for that case study so that you as students can have some sort of basic background information about the Chesapeake Bay area, as well as sort of the history of oysters and things like that in the Chesapeake Bay. Obviously, as you can see, I didn't write this PowerPoint, but it's by the authors of the case study to provide this sort of base information. So I'm going to go through it quickly and hit the sort of highlights and important bits from the presentation that will then hopefully help translate to a better understanding of the case study and then my expectations for what I want you to learn from the case study. I think it's a really good case study, and it provides a really good opportunity to look at ecosystems in general and then how humans interact with ecosystems and the multifaceted issues that come up when we're talking about ecosystem management. All right. The next slide, there it goes, is a brief overview of this Chesapeake Bay region in the U.S. So this is on the eastern seaboard. Here we have Virginia, Maryland. This urban spot right here, that's Washington, D.C. And so we have this, this whole area is the Chesapeake Bay that is this sort of broad area, and then moving into the Atlantic Ocean over here that we're talking about. This part of the country has been inhabited for a long time. This is John Smith, early European settler in this area, but prior to European settlement, indigenous populations inhabited this part of the country for millennia as well. So this is a place that has provided a high quality ecosystem for native plants and vegetation, as well as humans for thousands and thousands of years. And initially, this was a very attractive place for European settlers to come as well. Here we're pulling out to a somewhat wider view, and we're looking at what's known as the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. So again, here's the Chesapeake Bay, there's Washington, D.C., and we can see all these different states have areas that drain into the Chesapeake Bay. So if a drop of water falls anywhere within this green shaded area, eventually it'll work its way downstream and into the Chesapeake Bay. So we're covering a large number of states here. We've got New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, and Virginia. I think that was 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states. Yeah, so it's not 6 states in entirety, of course, but anytime we're covering an area that's as large as a 6-state watershed, it's a big area. And you know, part of the issue that we're talking about when we're talking about ecosystems and the effects of ecosystem effects onto a watershed, we're going to say, you know, central Pennsylvania is a very different sort of place than urban Washington, D.C., but it's still having major impacts because it's a significant portion of this watershed that's draining into the Chesapeake Bay. So this would all be coming into the north end here. So it's important to keep in mind the large the large spatial area of this watershed, but also that this watershed crosses a number of major political boundaries. So it's not, you know, it's not just contained to one state or one county, but we're crossing a number of different state lines, sometimes a few state lines by the time we get into the Chesapeake Bay itself. So these sorts of issues become quite complex. And the reality is that by the time, at the time of this writing of this case study, the health of this watershed, or the Chesapeake Bay rather, was at a very low level. They, you know, whatever criteria they used to assign a grade to this watershed, they came up with this D grade for the watershed in the area. And so we can really see that the large area of the watershed, along with the mixed uses within the watershed, really can contribute to the degradation of these waters over time. This is sort of a timeline of the health of the bay. So they're counting this sort of pristine or highly ecologically functioning area, 1600, so basically pre-European settlement in this area. And over time, 300 years really, we're getting this drop off, and this clock then starts again at 1900. And we see this precipitous drop in the health of the bay, really bottoming out in the early 1980s. But after the enactment of the Clean Water Act, and I'd say a broader awareness of these sorts of ecological issues and watershed issues, we see this slow climb back up. The sort of projected climb back up by 2050, 2060. So, at the writing of this case study, we're here down at a 27. So still pretty low. The Chesapeake Bay is a big water. It's sort of a big water area, and so it takes a long time for these impacts to accumulate. But once those impacts accumulate, they stick around for a long, long time as well. So that's a little bit on sort of the background of the Chesapeake Bay itself, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the more specific watershed impacts in a little bit. But part of the point of this case study is looking at oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, and oysters are a bivalve. They're an invertebrate that filter feeds in the water, and they're also an important component of the economies of these places, and they provide a high-quality food source for people and animals alike. Here's a nice little illustration of people buying oysters in the late 1800s, and these resources have been utilized by humans for a long, long time. Here we have a graph of the oyster harvest in Maryland, and we can see that they have this, again, this precipitous drop. This drop in the oyster harvest happened in the early 90s, sort of as a lag to the water quality that we saw. But there is some change over the years, and maybe as the health of the Chesapeake Bay increased in those early years, we saw an increase in the oyster harvest. There's a picture of an oyster. It's not a great picture, sorry. But they do have these big sort of flaky looking shells, and you open them up, and inside is this slimy little creature that some people think are delicious. I like them cooked personally, but not much for eating raw oysters myself. The case study talks about seeding oysters, and so they will wash small oysters into areas to promote growth and development of oyster communities and populations in the bay. So there are not just the sort of natural means of reproduction, but there are also these human means of reproduction for oysters in these places as well. And so one of these questions of the case study is, should, I think it's Ben Fisher, this politician, encourage the use of sort of these artificial means to grow new oysters rather than relying on building and taking a more naturalistic sort of approach to letting those populations recover on their own. And really what we're talking about also is, how do we impact the watershed in this area? And much of this watershed looks something like this. It's this sort of urban-suburban landscape. We have highly channelized streams. We've got a lot of flow off of roads and yards and things like that. And again, here we have this other typical sort of suburban scene where we have, again, these sort of urban runoffs. But also, if you think about central Pennsylvania, if you've never been there, it resembles northeast Iowa actually quite clearly. We have rolling hills, agriculture. This is big Amish country as far as tourism and things like that. So there's a lot of agriculture in this part of the watershed as well. And so we have lots of different sorts of impacts into this watershed, not just urban landscapes, but also rural landscapes. And if you know anything about Pennsylvania, West Virginia, parts of the Blue Ridge in Virginia, those are also coal mining and heavy industry areas as well. So we have lots and lots of different impacts all moving into this really big watershed. So we have steel mills and coal mines in Pennsylvania. coal mines in West Virginia, parts of Virginia here, a little bit in Maryland, heavy steel industry in Pennsylvania. I mean, we have Washington, D.C., so we have Baltimore. So we have really big urban areas as well as these urban, suburban industries. So lots and lots of different impacts moving into this broad and wide draining watershed into this Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. And so coming to grips with dealing with the myriad of different impacts into this body of water, and then the case study really is looking at how do we deal with the human or political issues that surround it. So I hope this helps get you started, gives you a pretty good background of the Chesapeake Bay watershed and a little bit about oysters. But this should get you started, and I look forward to your thoughts and ideas around oyster recovery in the Chesapeake Bay watershed.